I'm Andy Agathangelou, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. The Transparency Task Force is a certified social enterprise, which means that we exist to make an impact and not to make a profit. Our purpose, our mission, if you like, is to promote reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. And in many ways, this is about getting the financial industry to operate in a more transparent, more truthful, and more trustworthy way. We really do believe that there is good reason for concern about the conduct of financial services organizations. I'm going to share my screen to bring this particular point to life. What you're looking at is a table of the industries in the UK and how much they have been fined by relevant regulators. You'll see in last place we have the paints and coatings industry, which over the last 10 years, this data goes back 10 years, have only been fined £12,000. In second to last place, the apparel sector, they've been fined £90,000. In third to last place, the tobacco sector, 135,000. Now, there's very good reason to expect that the financial industry would behave in a suitably truthful, transparent, and ethical way, such that it was at the good end of this table. In other words, having a very low level of fines against it. But the harsh reality is nothing could be further from the truth. Not only is it not at the good end, it's definitely at the bad end. And not only is it at the bad end, it's actually top. In other words, it is the worst industry in the UK economy in terms of total pounds fines against it over the last 10 years. And this is an industry that, to function successfully, has by definition got to be trusted. If you take trust out of financial services, you really do have nothing left. Therefore, the very poor performance of the financial services sector in this regard ought to be a major panic, urgent situation for all stakeholders to be doing something about, including, of course, the regulators, which I'll come on to. Now, just to put this into context here, if you were to add up all of the industries from number 2 all the way through to number 46, adding them all up roughly equates to the financial services sector. So, to my mind, every ounce of energy that's directed towards the stewardship of the financial industry ought to be making a damn good effort to get the financial sector to behave properly, because the evidence shows it really isn't. It really isn't. And if I were a regulator of the financial services sector in the UK, I would be very worried indeed about the effectiveness of my work, because if you look into a bit more detail, first of all, you get the top 10 worst offending organizations. NatWest is the worst, Barclays, then Lloyds, UBS. You can read the rest of the top 10 naughty list here. But the real worry is this, and this really is at the very, very heart of what today's meeting is all about. The real worry is that if you scroll down the list of infringements, this is listed by case size, so the worst at the top and the not so worst towards the bottom. What you find, ladies and gentlemen, is a pattern. It's a very clear, irrefutable pattern that the same organizations are committing the same offenses, being fined in the same way, and it is having apparently no effect whatsoever on the conduct moving forward. This is a real worry. This points to two things. First of all, it points to the idea that the financial sector seems to consider getting fined for malpractice as part of an occupational hazard, so to speak, as if it were some kind of cost of doing business, like paying taxes or paying for your electric, an inevitable outcome. If you operate in financial services, you'll probably do something bad, you'll probably get fined. The data would seem to suggest that that is how things seem to be. But even more worryingly, if you were a financial regulator in charge of this industry, in other words, if you were the Financial Conduct Authority, surely you'd be looking at this data and you'd be saying to yourself, where is the evidence that our approach to improve the stewardship and conduct in the financial sector is having an effect? Because I can't see any here. Why is it that the Financial Conduct Authority appears to be very, very reluctant indeed to make use of the excellent powers given to it through Parliament in relation to the senior managers certification regime? Why is it that the Financial Conduct Authority goes about its work in such a way that there appears to be no, or at least virtually no, personal jeopardy for the individuals running these organizations, making decisions about, for example, new product sign-off, making decisions about, for example, the communication around marketing products? Why is it that there appears to be either no or virtually no personal jeopardy at all for these sorts of people? In fact, arguably, ladies and gentlemen, it's even worse than that. There have been people put in prison for malpractice, malfeasance, misconduct, selling, etc. For example, people connected to the LIBOR rigging issues, where all the evidence now appears to be that they've been the fall guys for people higher up the food chain who really had the power to control what was going on within the industries that they were working for. So, ladies and gentlemen, here we have a situation where I believe the 14th occasion where the Financial Conduct Authority is considering a consumer duty. Now, as the other speakers will elaborate on, I'm sure, there's been a great big hoo-ha about whether in fact the Financial Conduct Authority is actually in breach of its parliamentary responsibilities. Allow me to elaborate. In 2021, there was the Financial Services Act that made it very, very clear that the Financial Conduct Authority had to consult on a duty of care. And as our other speakers will elaborate, including Mark Bishop, a duty of care has particular significance in relation to the legal framework. It has real weight to it. We believe that had the FCA consulted on the duty of care, we would be a lot further forward than we are. But no, the consultation isn't about a duty of care, it's about a consumer duty. And as you'll be hearing from today's speakers, a consumer duty, in all honesty, is little more than a glorified version of treating customers fairly. And we all know how ineffective that's been used to control market conduct. So we are actually quite suspicious. We are quite suspicious about whether the Financial Conduct Authority is pulling its punches here. In other words, whether it is deliberately failing to consult on a duty of care, and whether it is deliberately failing to introduce what would make a consumer duty quite potent, which would be a private right to action. Now, this isn't just lazy speculation on my part or the part of the speakers who'll be talking to us today. There are many, many individuals and organizations who are really quite angry that one of the most straightforward opportunities for the FCA to start to properly protect consumers from harm and to drive the kind of change that is desperately needed in our sector, why is that opportunity not being taken? Is it true, ladies and gentlemen, that the City of London is so powerful that it's able to influence the Treasury to such a degree that the Treasury has influence over the FCA? That is certainly one of the conclusions that's come about as a consequence of the interest rate hedging product investigation by John Swift. You may be familiar with the fact that a very well-respected Times journalist, James Hurley, has made reference publicly to the idea that there has been lies by Treasury and the banks about their attempts to influence the FCA. Now, just before I pass over to Mark Bishop in just 30 seconds or so, I want to put a question out there. And in a way, this question is part of the subtext to today's meeting. Is the Financial Conduct Authority, to one degree or another, captured? Just this morning, I attended a brief presentation run by UK Finance, the trade body of the banks, talking about the idea of introducing a competitiveness agenda. And the competitiveness agenda is essentially, when you strip back all the marketing gloss around it and all the nice fluffy language, the competitiveness agenda is essentially about taking more control over the UK regulatory framework. And frankly, as they would see it, taking the opportunity to get rid of red tape and bureaucracy. It is essentially a deregulatory agenda. Despite the fact that even people like Andrew Bailey, now Governor of the Bank of England, has previously been on record, as have many others, suggesting that any kind of introduction of a competitiveness agenda is likely to be a very bad idea. Indeed, many scholars conclude that one of the things that brought about the global financial crisis, which caused horrific human cost and suffering around the world, not just in monetary terms, there were over 10,000 people who committed suicide as a direct consequence of the global financial crisis. By the way, that's not me making that number up. That's Oxford University research published in one of the leading journals of depression and so on and so forth. Over 10,000 people killed themselves because of a global financial crisis that was at least in part brought about by a deregulatory agenda. So we are talking about very, very serious issues. And that is why the Transparency Task Force and others are pushing back very hard on the competitiveness agenda, and also absolutely pushing back on the idea of introducing a watered down version of a duty of care called a consumer duty, which frankly, without a right to action for the individual, amounts to little more than treating customers fairly revisited Mark II. How can it be that this is the 14th time, according to comments in the House of Lords, by the way, that's where I'm sourcing that number from, how can it be that the FCA is exploring this consumer duty of care issue for the 14th time? Every time there's a consultation, the same thing happens. All the pro-consumer groups, the groups that want the public to be better protected, say, we need it now. The industry says the opposite. Net result, the consumers lose out, the industry gets what it wants. It seems as though every time there's a 50-50 ball, so to speak, in footballing terms, between the City of London and the citizen loses out. We absolutely have to do all we can to address this issue as strongly as possible. And of course, the part that we're playing in all of that is to make sure that we submit a very, very robust consultation response, which is what myself and many others in the Transparency Task Force have been working very hard doing over some time. I'm now going to pass over to Mark Bishop, and I'll be returning with some other thoughts later. Let's all make this as constructive a session as possible. Please do understand that what you're going to be hearing this afternoon is not careless speculation. There really is very good evidence to suggest that the way we are thinking is actually quite an accurate way to think about the situation, given the realities of what we've seen in recent time. Thank you very much indeed for allowing me to set the scene in that way. I'll now pass over to Mark Bishop, who today, once again, is, I'm sure, going to do an excellent job to elaborate on the key points of the session. Mark Bishop, over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed, Andy, and thank you everybody for coming along. I'm going to share screen as I've done a brief presentation for you. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. So I'm now going to go into presentation mode. There we are. Is the screen now filled with my slide?
It is.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. So I'm going to run through just a small number of slides that together I hope kind of paint a useful picture. So the first thing is really to talk about why we're here today. And as far as I'm concerned, we're here for one reason only, and that is because the FCA is consulting on the duty of care. For those of you who don't know the background to it, I'll explain it's this. As Andy has said, there have been 14 attempts over the years, over more than 2 decades, to get the regulatory environment into a place in which breach of any of its rules would constitute a breach of a duty of care. Now, I've got to define, therefore, what a duty of care is. I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding from those who are is a duty of care is an obligation on one party to avoid causing reasonably foreseeable harm to another party. And obviously, you have to specify who those parties are. And in the context of financial services, the parties that must not do harm are the authorised persons. And authorised persons means the firms and individuals that are authorised by the FCA and therefore appear on their register with live permissions. So those are authorised persons, and the persons that they must not harm are consumers. Consumers are individual persons, and they're also small businesses. So you can see that that right, or that duty of care, that obligation, is of value to consumers, because it means that there is a requirement on firms and individuals in the industry to avoid harming them. Now, why does this matter? Well, the main reason why it matters is that a duty of care is legally enforceable, specifically after the fact. So if I am harmed by a bank, I can sue that bank for redress. Now, if there was not a duty of care, that would not be the case. If I was harmed by a bank, I could sue the bank if I was a customer and if there was a specific breach of a contract between us. And there's a difference between a consumer and a customer, because there are many areas of financial services in which there is not a contractual relationship between the consumer and the firm or individual that may be harming them. Now, after many years, 14 attempts, wording, clause 29, which became section 29 of the Financial Services Act 2021, was passed into law, and it required the FCA to consult about introducing rules that would bring into effect a duty of care. It had to then bring forward rules based on the consultation. Now, the FCA is smart. You know, they've got good lawyers, and they came up with a thing that was not called a duty of care. It was called a consumer duty. And they said that this is a much better thing. And it was much better because it didn't just say avoid causing foreseeable harm. It came up with pages and pages of definitions of how firms should treat their customers. And you could therefore say, this thing is better than a duty of care. But actually, the clever little kind of bait and switch is that it's not better than the duty of care, because it does not give rise to a right to litigate, not in and of itself. Instead, it's like all breaches of the FCA rules have been for all of these years under the FSA as well before, which is if there is a breach of the rules, then in theory the FCA can enforce against it. But you are wholly reliant on the FCA to take that decision, both to enforce as in to punish, but also as to the consequences of that, either a restitution order under sections 382 or 384 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, or a section 404 redress scheme. Those are the powers that it has, but it uses them hardly ever. And as we've seen in John Swift's report, he is very critical of the FCA's decision not to go down the enforcement route, no investigation, no redress, no restitution in the case of IRHPs, where it should have done so. A judicial review is on foot as a result. Now, if you take the consumer duty and you only consult on that if you're the FCA, then very clearly you are in breach of the legal obligation placed upon you by the 2021 Act to consult about a duty of care. It's not difficult. So how did the FCA get away with this? Well, again, they were clever, they were sneaky. They included a consultation section on what they called a private right of action, which is a right of consumers to sue authorised persons if those authorised persons breach the consumer duty and the consumers suffer loss as a result. Now, that isn't exactly a duty of care, but it's near as damn it. But what they cleverly did was to put that in one section of the consultation and say, we don't really think this is a good idea. It's not a good idea, is it? And they hoped for responses that would say, actually, it's a really shit idea. We hope it doesn't go ahead. Now, of course, what happened was that almost all of the consumer groups, revved up in part by us, came up with consultation responses that said, of course, consumers should have a private right of action. And actually, it's a complete no-brainer. It can never be a bad thing for a consumer to have a right. Even if they never use the right, having a right is a good thing. So, and of course, all the industry respondents said, no, we don't think a private right of action is needed. This consumer duty sounds really tough, and we're sure that the FCA will enforce against it really rigorously. So we don't think this thing is needed at all. So you've got this consumer versus industry thing. If you follow the link in my slides, you'll see the minutes in Hansard of a meeting with the Treasury Committee in which FCA top brass, the chair and the chief executive, basically admitted that it's a consumer versus industry issue, and at the moment they are siding with the industry. Now, given the way that consultations work, you can take them to judicial review if they are effectively ignored or overridden. So it is absolutely important or essential that all consumer representatives respond to this stage 2 consultation, which closes on the 15th of Feb. There's a link to it from this slide, and that you respond saying that we do want a private right of action. If we all do that, and if we outnumber the industry responses, there is a chance that they may cave in. If they don't cave in, there is a chance of a judicial review or political pressure being brought to bear that might result in it happening. So that is why it's important. Okay, trying to get to the next slide. Here we are. So the question is, why is the FCA against a private right of action? It seems to me there are two possible explanations. The first is that they don't want to be disintermediated. Basically, they don't want to be bypassed. A private right of action means that consumers basically do not need the FCA, which may be complacent, conflicted, or captured. And instead, they, consumers, we, can impose the negative externalities of bad faith firms' behaviour on those firms and even on the individuals. Imagine that, the individuals, if a boss of a bank, signs off a dodgy scheme of one sort or another, we could actually sue that boss, never mind the firm. Now, the threat of that would have a dramatic effect on their behaviour. The second reason, which actually is in the consultation document, is that some in the industry are worried about the transition. They think that it will be difficult for them fully to comply with the consumer duty from day one, and they are really worried about being sued as a result of any of those breaches in the early days. Okay, so how can we challenge those concerns? And from the point of view of the people who are going to respond to the consultation, I'm really referring here to questions 1, 15, 17, and 19. Now, the disintermediation point, I think what you effectively do is you try and flush it out. Already in the Treasury Committee meeting that I referred to and have linked to in this document, Nikhil Rati, perhaps unwisely, admitted that if consumers had this right, firms might be less likely to launch products that could cause there to be litigation. Now, of course, there would only be litigation if there was a reasonable prospect of succeeding, which implies that actually there would have to be a breach of the consumer duty. Now, if there's a breach of the consumer duty and the behaviour would change only if consumers had the right to enforce against it, what is effectively saying is either the industry doesn't believe that the regulator would enforce against it or that it actually wouldn't. So these things are actually arguments for why consumers should be empowered with the private right of action. As for the transition thing, I'm a pragmatist here. I do understand that this industry has been mollycoddled, it has been protected by its regulator for a very long time, and there are people in the industry who do think that a new rule coming in means actually you should work towards being in compliance with the rule at some point, not that you should be fully compliant on day one. Given that that's their expectation, a pragmatic approach would be to say, okay, let's have the private right of action 6 months or a year or whatever after the consumer duty comes into effect. This gives them a reasonable time to implement it, and it gives them a grace period during which they will not be liable if they fail to do so. Now, there'll be some consumers who lose out as a result of that, I have no doubt. But if it's a choice between this and not having a private right of action, I would be prepared to take that gamble and allow there to be a few people affected. Now, as far as both of these things are concerned, I think we have to continue to challenge the legitimacy of the consultation and the misdirection of respondents, in particular, the description of what is a description of what is a duty of care in the original consultation document, has been disproven to be accurate by lawyers up to and including an eminent QC. So the landing zone, I think the thing that will be acceptable to consumers, to the honest majority in the industry, and to decent individuals within the FCA would be this kind of landing zone of a delayed private right of action. Not delayed by 3 or 5 years, but delayed by 6 or 12 months. So I'm very much hoping that consumer groups might be prepared to come up with a response that is based along those lines, because I think that there is the best chance of it getting through. Now, I'm going to talk about a few more of the questions that were raised in the consultation and ways that I think it would be prudent to respond to them. So the first of these is question 2, which talks about the distribution chain. I think it's an important principle that firms must be responsible for the counterparties that they introduce to work with them, and not just for their own actions or inactions. An example of this would be that Link Group should be liable for having appointed, in inverted commas, Woodford Investment Management to be the asset manager in the Woodford Equity Income Fund. Now, we know in reality that the appointment went the other way around, but in the documentation, it was definitely Link that appointed Woodford, and therefore Link is responsible for what Woodford did. And this matters because, of course, if you're an investor in an open-ended fund such as WEIF, you are not directly a customer of the asset manager. You don't have a contract between you and that firm, but that firm should have a duty of care towards you, and it should, if it doesn't have that, it should at least have obligations under consumer duty which you can enforce. The authorised firm must also be responsible for the unauthorised, and there are 2 instances of this. The most common kind of regulatory cat flaps, if you like, so that people outside the regulatory perimeter can have some legitimacy and not be prosecuted. One is you get an authorised firm to approve your promotions, and the second one is the authorised representatives regime, whereby you can appoint all kinds of dodgy people that would never themselves, even in the incompetence of the FCA's authorisations department, be authorised. You can authorise these people yourself. And I think it's very important that the authorised firm is responsible for those people and for those promotions. The third question relates to existing products. Basically, the consultation document asks whether firms should be responsible under the consumer duty for products that were launched before the consumer duty came out. Now, they say that firms should not be expected to give up expected contractual rights where these conflict with the consumer duty. I think that is unreasonable. If, for example, let's think of an instance, somebody bought a mortgage book and that party is not necessarily an authorised firm, they cannot continue to extract unreasonable standard variable rates from mortgage prisoners because actually they still have a consumer duty. The FCA Mortgage Prisons Review very much implied that the consumer duty would help those victims. They are now proposing, in terms of what they're saying about giving up rights on existing products, that they would not be helped by the consumer duty. So which is it to be? The fifth is the consumer principle. This is part of this kind of very carefully worded and designed to look rigorous consumer duty. I think it's important that the consumer duty and therefore private right of action must apply to all authorised persons, which means individuals as well as firms. Very often in the consultation document, the FCA uses the term firms, and I feel sure that that's the direction it's trying to take this. And also to all consumers, whether those consumers are clients or not. And again, they often switch into using the term clients, and it wouldn't surprise me if there would be a further bait and switch in the final rules, and you would find out that it's firms and clients and not authorised persons and consumers. Again, we've got to push back on that. The FCA attempts to parlay one into the other in quite a shameful way. It may also be a breach of Section 29 of the Financial Services Act 2021, which is the thing that obliged it to consult about a duty of care, because the further you get away from a duty of care, the more you end up actually with something that is there's not a consultation carried out in good faith. Some other important points in the consultation. Question 8, the cross-cutting rules, again, part of this kind of verbiage that's made to look like the consumer duty really matters. A good outcomes test, which is what they're looking for. They're saying that a firm must achieve a good outcome for its client, and notice firm and client again, must achieve a good outcome. But this is a very difficult test in financial services because, as we know, sometimes the gap between making the purchase decision and the outcome can be in years and even in decades. You know, think of mortgages, life assurance, things like that. This test, therefore, cannot be applied only retrospectively, must be used, and breach must be determined as soon as it becomes reasonably foreseeable, a great phrase from the genuine duty of care, that an outcome is likely to be bad. Okay, questions 9, 11 and 12, which kind of wrap up a lot of bits and pieces. They talk very much about the manufacture and the distribution of a financial services product, as if those are the points at which the consumer duty applies. And of course, the consumer duty should apply at both of those points, but there's a third point at which it absolutely must apply, and that is delivery. The implication is that the regulator is emphasising what happens before and at the point of sale and ignoring the lengthy process of delivering as promised. Now, obviously, given that the delivery thing is often much longer than the design and sale thing, there is much more scope for things to go wrong at that point. And there is also scope for the person responsible for delivery and the person responsible for design and distribution to disagree about whose fault it is. So again, this matter must be resolved. Communications must also almost be ongoing when appropriate. So, for example, when there are products that are delivered over a long time, if there is a need to update people about their product, that must happen and must be done well. They talk about exit fees as being acceptable if they're in a legacy agreement, and they may even be acceptable in new agreements. I think that given the FCA's competition mandate, the start point must be that exit fees are unacceptable. On question 10, finally, they talk about issues about price and value. You know, is the consumer duty being fulfilled if there is kind of extractive pricing going on? Well, we are concerned that the FCA doesn't expect the consumer duty to prevent firms from charging different prices to consumers in different circumstances. Of course, we accept that the risk of insuring a driver may vary with the age and experience, to give just one example. But it doesn't vary by the choice of distribution channel, what browser they're using on their computer, or even what their email provider is. And I'm aware of examples of all of those things being used to trigger differential pricing in financial services. Now, the argument might be, for example, that a person who's still using a Hotmail account or an AOL one or something like that, you know, may not be up with the latest tech and therefore might not be the most likely to shop around on price. You know, personally, I see that there is a risk that those things could be proxies for vulnerability, and we shouldn't be allowing and encouraging the financial services industry to extract value from the vulnerable. Now, that's pretty much those slides done. I will stress something here that's really important, and I mentioned it in passing earlier on, and that is that it's not all about the numbers, but it's mostly about the numbers. The number of consumer responses that say we must have a private right of action, we're prepared to have it delayed even by a small amount of time, you know, rather than not have it. The number of those versus the number of industry responses that say there's no need for a private right of action, that equation matters very much. Now, everybody who is attending this event has the right to respond to this consultation. You could do so as a representative of a group other than TTF, as a representative of a company, if you're involved with one, or as an individual. It's entirely legitimate for you to do that, and it matters very much that you do, because the numbers are what counts. Okay, I think I've kind of been through those slides and hopefully done justice to them. I don't know if we're having questions now or moving on to the next presenter.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. Before we do anything else, let's show our appreciation to Mark for once again preparing and delivering such a helpful and clear and compelling presentation. Mark, thank you very, very much indeed. We've had quite a bit of traffic going on in the chat, which is always great to see. Does anybody have a question or a comment they'd like to make at this point? Just wave a hand at me if you'd like to do so. Otherwise, I'm going to come in myself with some further thoughts. I'll do that now then. So first of all, I'm going to share my screen. So this is the web page. I'll put a link to it in the chat in a moment. This is the FCA's Consumer Duty Consultation web page. As you can see here, as Mark mentioned, we have until the 15th of February to provide a response to it. The TTF is getting rather good because of help by people like Mark, particularly Mark actually. We're getting rather good at providing consultation responses. Here are all the ones we provided last year. I think it's 17 in all. I think I'm on quite safe ground if I were to say that the TTF probably responded to more financial services consultations than any other organisation in the country last year. This year, it's only the 10th of February. We've already responded to 4, and the one we submit next week about consumer duty will be our 5th. So we are punching well above our weight. And the way that we respond is we respond through developing a consensus view. So this is the actual live work in progress document. I think there's 35 pages or so far. Yep, 35 pages. We put ideas together, we kind of thrash out differences of opinion. We eventually get to a consensus view and then we submit it. And I have to tell you that we are accessing some, phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal subject matter expertise from a range of stakeholders, including people with legal backgrounds, regulatory backgrounds, compliance backgrounds. Perhaps the one thing that makes the TTS responses so unique is that they are always true to what we call our North Star question. And our North Star question is, what is best for the consumer? We do not look at these issues from the point of view of what is best for the industry, what is best for the Chancellor of the Exchequer, what is best for UK PLC. It is the individual citizen, the individual member of the public that we are loyal to when putting these responses together. And I'm very, very proud to say that. Now, this particular topic, the topic of duty of care, private right of action and class actions, is one of our formal battlegrounds for 2022. Those of you who came to the events we ran on the 16th of December and January the 4th might recognize this slide. It's our kind of framework for why we are doing what we are doing in this area. As you can see in the what column, the goal, we want to make the case for a private right of action to accompany consumer duty. Why? And I'm going to go over these points because I think there's some really powerful ones here. Why? Because this would increase the chance that if consumers will be compensated if they are ripped off. Also, because this would dramatically improve market conduct, because companies would know they were in real jeopardy if they acted badly. This is a phenomenally important point. If there were a duty of care or a consumer duty with a private right of action, it would change market behavior because companies creating and selling products would be very mindful that they're doing so at the risk of being punished if they don't. That's really, really important. It would therefore reduce the chances of poor products being brought into the market. And if a private right of action can be achieved, the next step would be to campaign for the introduction of class actions in the UK based on the approach taken in the United States. This would lead to low cost and low risk access to justice for those that have been harmed by the financial services sector. The how-to, that's the battle plan for how we're going about doing it. Well, we're going to continue to highlight the fact that the FCA has not consulted as Parliament wanted. I'm going to repeat that because I'm making a really strong statement here. The Financial Conduct Authority's consultation on consumer duty is not in keeping with the Financial Services Act 2021, which required it to consult on a duty of care. We quite literally suspect that the FCA may quite literally be breaking the law laid in Parliament last year, and that's a serious matter. Secondly, we also believe that we should continue to actively engage with parliamentarians. Those of you who know TTF will know that we are secretariat to 2 all-party parliamentary groups, which, by the way, are in the process of being combined into one, which is good news. We are recruiting the response team for the consumer duty consultation. We've been doing that for some time. We are probably 80–90% of the way complete, but if you want to contribute to that consultation response, you can. But remember what Mark said, every single individual can submit a response. If, for example, you wanted to refer to our response before submitting your own, whether you're doing so as an individual or as an organisation or a collection of organisations, you are very, very welcome to do so. We're going to continue to do all we can in terms of PR and public affairs, to work with other consumer groups and to essentially develop an alternative consumer network. What we mean by that is this: the Financial Conduct Authority's approach to engaging with the marketplace is unsatisfactory. There's far too little engagement between pro-consumer organisations and the FCA, and that needs to change. The reason it needs to change is because if it doesn't change, we will continue to have a very, very one-sided lobbying battle where the industry, with its might and its muscle and its contacts and its conversations in the corridors of power, its involvement with the Treasury, etc., will just dominate the landscape. And what's right for the consumer will always just be a second priority, if that. Very, very important points. Just check in with you folks. Does anybody have anything they'd like to say before we move on to our next speaker, Mr. Peter O'Donnell? Okay.
Yes, and I...
Yes, go on then, David. Thank you.
Sorry.
David, you're on mute, I think. Try and take yourself off mute, David, if you can. Otherwise, we'll swiftly move on to Peter. You clicked it once.
While he's doing that, can I ask you?
Go on,
I
David.
wrote to the MP asking her to get the Director of Public Prosecutions involved because of the lack of prosecutions against fraudsters. I found that Mr. Woodford of the Woodford Group went to Jersey and he started up there. You know, this is just not on. The Public Prosecution Office appears to be paying no attention to the scammers or reports of scams. I even had occasion to write to the SFO about a scam coming from Zurich, where they tried to con me into saying, "Oh, we'll get your money back for you." Plus 37% compensation. You know, this scam is going on all the time.
There are.
And they just are not paying attention to it.
I think you're absolutely right, David, and thank you so much for stepping forward and making that point. We understand through Anthony Stansfeld, the former police crime commissioner for Thames Valley Police and former UK lead on fraud, that something like, 1% of police resources goes towards tackling fraud, even though a shocking 35 or 36% of all crime in the UK relates to fraud. I think you're absolutely right, David, you really are. By the way, you mentioned Woodford, as Mark did earlier. We do have an event all about the Woodford scandal on, I think it's April the 4th. I'll check the date and I'll put it in the chat. Mr. Turnbull, thank you very much for your contribution. We'll go to Barry James, who'll make his point now, and then we'll probably jump back to our next speaker, Peter O'Donnell. Thank you.
Yeah, you mentioned network just a few moments ago, and I apologise if because I was a bit delayed joining if you said more on it. But if you can sort of reprise that or tell us a little bit more, that'd be brilliant, because this is a parallel, what's sometimes called a parallel structure, much needed. The FCA need to know. They're used to getting away with consultations that are window dressing. The only way that's going to stop is if they know there's going to be someone who isn't going to go away, is going to be there the next day and the next and the next. So music to my ears to hear of a network.
Well, thank you very much. I'll comment a little bit further, then I'll go to Mark, who just popped his hand up. He wants to chip in on this point as well. So there are, sort of, if you like, two networks relating to the FCA. There's the consumer, there's the product providers network, the organisations that engage with the industry and engage with the FCA, and there's also a consumer network. And for reasons I'm sure Mark will touch on, neither of them seem to be that effective. And there's also the Financial Services Consumer Panel. Two of the former chairs of the Financial Services Consumer Panel, they being Sue Lewis and John Howard, are members of the Transparency Task Force's advisory group. You know, really good people, really on side, very, very genuinely pro-consumer. Many people comment that the Financial Services Consumer Panel is not doing its job anything like as well as it used to in terms of providing proper scrutiny and challenge to the FCA. Mark, we'll go to you, then we'll jump over to Peter O'Donnell. Thank you, Mark.
Okay, thank you. So I just thought I would give a bit more of an answer to Barry, because I think it's an interesting subject. So the FCA is supposed to kind of consult with consumer groups, and it does this by creating this thing that it calls the Consumer Network. And on the Consumer Network are a number of organisations, and many of these organisations are ones that only do a little bit to do with financial services. So, for example, Citizens Advice, you know, would be an instance. You know, they'll talk about people's benefits, their housing, their employment, blah, 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 and a little bit about financial services. Or they're organisations that talk about a particular circumstance. For example, you know, Age UK, or, you know, the Alzheimer's UK, or whatever. You know, they talk about people who are in a particular life stage, and a small part of that life stage impacts on financial services. So these organisations are, all of them, genuinely well-meaning. They all want to do the right thing for consumers, including in financial services. But not all of them know that much about financial services. So what happens is the FCA, when it gets a consultation, has to do a consultation on the subject. It calls a meeting of the Consumer Network, and it briefs them about the consultation. And, you know, you might speculate that during this consultation briefing, they kind of put across what their line is on a particular issue. So taking the private right of action as an example, they might say, we think the private right of action is not needed and could even be harmful, because it's really expensive for consumers to sue people. And this is particularly true for vulnerable consumers, people who are financially excluded, who don't have very much money, you know, the elderly, the blah, blah, blah. Each of those is a particular interest group that they're talking to. And those people all hear that little kind of tip. And they may then come to believe, well, this is true, you know, it is expensive to litigate, you know, it is difficult if you've got dementia to litigate, it is blah, blah, blah. You know, so these people end up kind of spitting back to the FCA the bullets that the FCA gave them to fire. And therefore you get a whole load of consultation responses that say exactly what the FCA hopes that the consumers will say. Now, we spotted this, and we tried to resolve it. I think Andy will can confirm that he had various forms of correspondence with the FCA in which he said, could Transparency Task Force join this consumer network? We have more members than a lot of these groups. We have a lot more depth of knowledge in financial services because it's the only thing that we do. We don't do any other stuff at all. And would you therefore let us in? And they said, well, no. The network is currently full, and anyway, you're a different type of organisation. You know, you don't have kind of consumer helplines where you try and help individuals. And I said, well, we have our Scam Smart events. We invite people who have been long victims of scams, and we help them. No, not really interested. Not a helpline. You know, what if we opened a helpline? Well, no. You know, and basically they don't want us in it. And you can speculate that's because if they brought us along, we would give a different perspective to those voluntary organisations that might say, well, actually, this could be why the industry wants it a particular way, but this is why we think it's not the right thing for consumers to do it that way. So they don't want us in. So that's why we've kind of come up with this alternative approach, which is that over time, you'll see us engaging more and more with these voluntary organisations. They'll be invited along to events such as this one, and in these symposia we will say, look, this is the Transparency Task Force position and this is why we think it's right. If you don't agree with us, you know, let's have a conversation about that. You know, if you've heard the FCA's perspective, be interested to know what it is. If we think it's reasonable, we'll agree with it. We'll put in our consultation response. You know, we're not starting from the point of view that everything that the FCA says is wrong, but we are starting from the point of view that they may have a particular interest in briefing you in a specific way and in excluding us from that conversation. So that's really where we are on the consumer network.
Mark, thank you very, very much indeed. Anybody else want to quickly say something before we pass over to Peter O'Donnell? In which case, let's pass straight over to Peter O'Donnell. Peter's been a very, very active supportive member of the Transparency Task Force community for several years. He provides an extremely valuable perspective on all of this. In fact, Peter, whether you were planning to or not, would you mind please spending a little bit of time explaining how you got into this space in the very first place? Because I really do want people to understand why your perspective is such a valuable one, and a kind of seen it from the worst perspective imaginable. So Peter, over to you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I was a victim of a Ponzi scheme that stole £125 million from UK consumers with the active participation of a high street bank to enable people to take out large equity release interest only mortgages to invest with. That's what happened to me. My bank manager recommended that I take out a massive remortgage of my property in St Albans, which I did, and invested with a firm of chartered accountants in Leicester. They were soon afterwards arrested by the Serious Fraud Office. They were charged and spent, just out of jail, they spent 7.5 years in jail. It took 4.5 years for them to be sentenced. And what the effect on my wife and I was to lose our house, move into a council house, and rebuild our lives. And part of that rebuilding, thankfully, involved starting a law firm to specialise in financial services action, both regulatory and private action, against the perpetrators of these bad acts. And now we have a very, very successful business. So I've been able to help people and help myself to get back on my feet. Is that sufficient, Andy?
It most definitely is. The fact that you've come through that particular journey, I think, means that you are able to relate to other victims very, very well. And I know from my own experience so far, having interacted with you for over many years, you bring a great degree of expertise, and you very often see things others don't see. So Peter, over to you. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to give you an anecdote. I was going to put it later in my presentation, but following on from what Mark said, because the people don't understand how it works, the system works, and there's some basic important information that will come out. I'll just give you a sort of it is an anecdote, but I'm sure it isn't one that I have actually heard or know about. I've made it up, but it really reflects the truth of what I know out there. A trainee financial advisor is introduced to her new boss. The young woman asks, "I've been told that you're the richest investment manager in the company. How do you do that without stealing?" "Simple," the boss said. "I advise my clients to invest with a company that pays me 30% of the funds invested for the introduction." Trainee: "Don't you lose clients when they find out?" The boss: "No, I make sure it is a 10-year investment term, so that in the 9th year, I move to a new company." Trainee: "Won't you face legal action for fraud?" Boss: "No, in the UK, it was a regulated activity, and the company is held responsible, not the advisor." Trainee: "What happened to the company you work for?" "Oh, they just put themselves into liquidation after starting another one." "Won't the liquidator investigate and report it?" "No, they're under no obligation to investigate regulatory misbehaviour, only what the insolvency service requires in a confidential report. Misadvising clients is an FCA matter. Once insolvent, the company is no longer regulated. Won't the new duty of care stop that?" "No, not that I can see. Happy days forever." So that encapsulates the involvement of the fact that no action can be taken against an individual. It can only be taken against the company. Advising people to invest money is a regulated activity, And the fact that you get a 30% kickback from the investment company, which shows that the investment is a fraud, isn't stopped or even investigated. And the ability for a company to put itself into voluntary liquidation means that there's always a get out of jail card free service, and the people who supervise insolvency, the insolvency practitioners, have no interest or knowledge of financial services operations and see that as the remit of the FCA only and not theirs, and they just wash their hands of it. Anyway, I'll move on. The new duty of care to significantly change the culture and behaviour of the industry for the benefit of consumers, to go from treating consumers fairly to pay due regard to the interests of its customers and treat them fairly. Is this to appear to protect clients whilst in reality changing nothing but the narrative? It's meant to go from a rules-based duty of care to an outcomes-based duty of care. There's no mention of consumer duty of care. To achieve these outcomes, to achieve this new paradigm shift, the industry is required to achieve 4 outcomes. Outcome 1, equip consumers to make effective, timely, and properly informed decisions about financial products and services. Outcome 2, products and services to be specifically designed to meet the needs of consumers and sold to those who need them, and that those are met. Outcome 3, customer service meets the needs of consumers, enabling them to realise the benefits of products and services and act in their interests without undue hindrance. And consumer outcome 4, the price of products and services represents fair value for consumers. Now, why does the FCA feel it is necessary to stiffen the industry duty of care to real retail clients now? And why has it been unnecessarily weak? Why aren't the individuals held accountable and complaints only made against the authorised company? What is wrong with a fiduciary duty of care standard that other professionals, doctors, accountants, lawyers, carpenters, are required to provide? Why isn't it a criminal offence to deliberately mislead mainstream clients to invest their retirement savings in scams? Why can you sue a surgeon for cutting off the wrong leg, but only use the FCA for advising your bad advice on your retirement savings? The FCA said in November 2019 that IFAs are prioritising their own commercial interests over clients, that IFAs are not demonstrating to the FCA that they understand their clients' needs and are making decisions for their own commercial interests, particularly around defined benefit pension transfer. Now, you really think that they've known this for a very, very long time, and they've had a very, very long to correct this. Now, a client paying a fee for ongoing advice is potentially much more beneficial to the business, but there is very little value to the client. What would you do in that situation? And the FCA said, we expect you to adhere to the regulatory and professional duty to give suitable advice to clients by identifying those conflicts of interest and managing it. But nothing changed. And I do not see how the new duty of care will change that at all. The FCA said, we want to see a higher level of consumer protection in retail financial markets, where firms are competing vigorously in the interests of consumers. Now, I really don't understand how that is of benefit to consumers, because competing vigorously means different things to different people. And I don't think the consumers understand, because once you talk to an IFA, how common is it for you to then go to another IFA to find out what the first IFA said? It is confusing enough for retail clients to understand what they're doing, and they tend to be led by professionals who are regulated, and there is insurance behind them to protect you. The FCA said, we are proposing to introduce a new consumer duty that would set higher expectations. Higher than what? For the standard of care that firms provide to consumers. For many firms, this would require a significant shift in culture and behaviour. What? So they're going to have culture and behaviour towards consumers rather than themselves, where they consistently focus on consumer outcomes. What was there before? And put consumers in a position where they can act and make decisions in their own interests. The test is, would I recommend my firm's products to my family or friends? The onset of consumer duty marks a shift from a rules-based regulatory approach to one based on outcomes. In my opinion, and when I came to this country from Australia 31 years ago, I did the foundation year degree with the Open University on social science to learn about the culture and the politics. What I learned was that in particular, a conservative government has an overriding philosophy is in that there is an absolute need to maintain the feeling of stability for the UK population and to ensure that anything which casts doubt on this is removed, in particular, doubt about the integrity of government and financial services. Is the public concerned about IFAs having the right duty of care? I don't think so. They expect it. Now, what is the difference between FCA duty of care and a fiduciary duty of care? The fiduciary duty exists where a person or company is required to put another person's interests before their own. It arises from a relationship of trust and confidence, such as the relationship between doctors and their patients, directors and their companies, agents and their principals. How does fiduciary duty apply to financial advisors today? Financial advisors are not bound by fiduciary standards. In the UK, advisors must adhere to the conduct of business rules set by the FCA. The good news is that the FCA is working towards improving the industry and keeping you safe. Why now? What has changed? Well, what's changed has been that £2.4 billion every year is stolen through misadvising clients to invest their pensions. And look at London Capital and Finance, 234 million has been taken, of which the marketing company that did the introduction, Surge, earned 30% or £80 million for the referrals. So where did the money go? London Capital and Finance, with the rest of the money, invested it in its own companies, generally offshore, and then they folded those companies with that money coming back through other companies, particularly in the Canary Islands. Common law, motivation for failing in duty of care, bribes to protect dishonest advice. In a recent ruling, Woods versus Commercial First Business Limited and others, the ruling clarified that the meaning of a bribe extends beyond the notion of a corrupt payment and includes an undisclosed payment or gift made in order to induce an agent. Quote, a customer does not have to establish that there was a fiduciary duty of care relationship with their agent, broker or introducer in order to bring a claim. They just need to show that the agent, broker, introducer owed a duty to be impartial and to give disinterested advice, information or recommendations, where the fiduciary was a regulated company acting contrary to the interests of clients is grounds for misfeasance against the directors and is relatively simple to bring. It may seem overly simplistic, but it is accurate to say that regulators don't stop corruption. In this country, regulators enable corruption. For an example, if someone takes £100 from my wallet it is called theft, is a crime, a police matter, and it can be prosecuted by a fine and or a custodial sentence. If I get advice from an IFA on how to invest £10,000 in a low to medium risk product for which I approve £4,000 for his service, sorry, £400 for his service, but he gives the money to another person who invests $5,000 in an offshore bond, keeping $2,300 for himself and $2,300 goes to the IFA. That is a regulated activity. After 2 years, I discovered that only $5,000 was invested, and this was in a very high unregulated product that since failed. Under UK financial services regulations, I must first complain to the advisor's firm, and if rejected or ignored, take my complaint to the Ombudsman Service. The Ombudsman Service takes on average 2 to 4 years to decide on the complaint. If upheld, the company is ordered to pay all £10,000 back without interest. The measure the FCA uses to assess the duty of care is what was fair and reasonable at the time the advice was given. My complaint could fail if the Ombudsman thinks that the level of duty of care required didn't apply in my circumstances and reject my complaint. However, this is pretty important. The company can refuse to pay, requiring legal action by me, or to put themselves into voluntary liquidation and not pay anyone, for which the case, my complaint goes to the FSCS. They can do this without penalty or restrictions on individuals. In other words, the directors and the people who work there who did the misfeasance can keep their regulated status, can continue to work in the industry, including as directors of other firms or authorised companies. Individuals are not held personally responsible. Only regulated companies are. And this is why, Andy, 1% of police resources go into 35% of fraud, white-collar crime, because it's seen as not their area of responsibility. It is a civil matter, not a police matter. The new duty of care won't change the fact that my advisor gets a get out of jail card free, which the FCA agrees that the company can't pay, such as in liquidation, and my complaint is upheld, pay me through the FSCS. Now apply my situation to that if someone lost £200,000 of their pension. I can only get £85,000 through the FSCS, but the FOS pays £50,000, can order £355,000. Now, 5 years of my life and all the emotional worry to get 85% of my money back, not including solicitor's fees if I want professional representation, which my company provides, which reduces the payment by another £30,000. Sorry, another 30%. If an insolvency practitioner is appointed to a regulated company, they aren't obligated to invest any of this behaviour and only report to the insolvency service on what happened. Conclusion. It is glaringly obvious that consumers come second to the institutions that provide retail financial services. Slowly, the industry is altering and improving the balance between duty of care, but the lack of coordination between financial services malfeasance and the insolvency means that harm to clients will go unchecked. In other leading Western countries, misrepresenting an investment for financial gain is a crime and punishable by long prison sentence. Example, in late 2009, James Moore partnered with Rennick Howdow, who is also a British citizen, to sell investments in a hotel scheme in which investors lost money. He did this with a marketing company, property sales company, regulated mortgage business and solicitors conveyancing firm, of which he owned and operated all. Clients paying to attend weekend property investment seminars and place deposits of up to £100,000 using equity release interest-only mortgages arranged by James Moore. Haddo had been disqualified as a director of any UK company for 8 years, and was later sued by the FCA for operating investment schemes through misrepresentation and losing substantial investors' money. Now, would an improved duty of care have stopped James Moore from defrauding clients in the UK? On the 2nd of February this year, Moore and Haddo were found guilty of operating an investment misrepresentation scheme for which they have now been jailed. This is last week, for 11 years and 8 months. And they absconded with £57 million from 800 investors. Now, would that have happened? That didn't happen when he did that in the UK. And in fact, he made more money out of that through instant access properties and his fuel wealth. So I don't think anything's going to change, except it's going to be cosmetic. And that's the end of my speech.
Peter, thank you very much indeed for preparing and presenting those thoughts. Thank you very, very much indeed. We'll go to our next speaker shortly, but before we do, let me just check in with everybody. Does anybody have a point or a question that they would like to put to Peter or anybody else? Yes, Peter. Indeed. Ian, could you please just start off by introducing yourself and give everybody a bit of an understanding of your background, Ian? And then
yeah, Ian Tyler. My background, I was a bank treasurer for many years, and then I've been a consultant, advising financial firms. But I just really wanted to ask a very quick question, Peter. You didn't say which country put these people in jail, because you didn't say who it was.
New York.
Oh, so basically they did something. They did something against American citizens, so they ended up paying for it.
They had an investment scheme where people invested in hot desking. Yeah. And so you invested $10,000 in a scheme where desks in offices were rented out, and you got an income return on that. And in America, misrepresenting an investment is seen as a federal crime. It is investigated by the FBI and is prosecuted by a federal judge, in a federal court.
Yeah.
Now, we have no equivalent to the FBI or federal courts in this country.
Yeah. Okay, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. I just was very interested to understand which jurisdiction had treated him in that manner.
I know it's the same in Australia, where I come from. Someone I knew very well took $500,000 in a Ponzi scheme investment, and he was sentenced to a minimum term of 10 years and 3 months.
So the lesson is, if you've got bad intentions, carry on acting in the UK is the best.
This is the best place in the world to steal money
through
white collar crime. Absolutely.
To be fair, that's I don't know if you listened to Prime Minister questions yesterday, but actually all the questions that Keir Starmer asked were precisely on this issue of fraud and things. So it is quite a topical issue at the moment.
It definitely is. I think Yvette Cooper has picked this up as a bit of a campaign theme as well for her part of the system too. Peter, thank you very, very much indeed. Does anybody else have anything for Peter before we move on to Richard? In which case we're going to move on to Richard, but before we do, let's show our appreciation to Peter. Peter, thank you very much for preparing and presenting your session. Thank you. Good man. Lots of very valuable content as always. And the contrast between how the UK operates and how the US operates in this regard is really awful. For some reason, it seems as though in the United States, they are worried about there being a lack of trust and confidence in the financial ecosystem. They behave as if it really does matter, and they close things down as soon as they can. They quite literally send in the FBI. In the UK, we have the National Crime Agency, we have Action Fraud, we've got various other bits of the system that seem not to work. Very, very interesting indeed. Mr. Richard Emery, over to you, sir. Thank you very much for being with us today, and thank you for what you're about to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. First of all, I want to recognise the excellent work that Mark has done, as indeed on previous occasions, in terms of preparing the response and in terms of Peter's comments as well. I just want to add a few comments looking at it very much from the consumer's view of what are the problems that consumers face at the moment, and how can we ensure that what happens in the future resolves these issues. And fundamentally, these the comments sit around the overall topic of access to justice. So if I start off by looking at the FCA handbook, the FCA handbook in section DISP 2.7.6 2b says that a person can make a complaint against their bank through the Financial Ombudsman Service if the bank is involved in an authorised push payment fraud. It doesn't matter whether they are the sending bank or the receiving bank. We now have a right, which we didn't have in the past, to make a complaint against both the sending bank and the receiving bank if you've been involved in fraud. And this comes down to a very important question of the responsibility of the banks to prevent fraud, because the cross-reference is at paragraph 2.7.7 subparagraph 2, which is the complainant makes the complaint that the bank did not do enough to prevent or respond to alleged authorised push payment fraud. So what my concern here is that in establishing the right of action, we need to ensure that we have a right of action that allows the consumer to directly challenge both their bank and also the receiving bank because they failed to prevent the fraud from taking place. Now, I'm going to very briefly touch on 3 case studies. Amy lost £70,000. She sought to take a civil action against one of the banks. She processed that action through the courts, and the bank put up a team to fight her. So she was a small sole trader. They put up a team to fight her. And at one of the hearings, the judge asked the question, why is the bank represented by a QC, a junior, the partner from the firm of solicitors, the solicitor, a clerk, and 2 administrators? Why do we need all of these people for what is actually simply a process of a hearing in the course of the action? And eventually the bank managed to get a strikeout order against the claim. And they got the strikeout order on the basis that the claimant hadn't managed to produce the documents to show that the bank had failed in its obligations. What the court ignored was that the individual had made a request for disclosure. The bank had been ordered to disclose the relevant documents, and the bank hadn't disclosed the documents. So the claimant didn't have the documents because the bank hadn't disclosed the documents, and because the claimant didn't have the documents, the bank got the court to issue a strikeout on the claim. Now, that has to be nonsense, but it gets worse. She didn't only lose her £70,000 claim. In a classic David and Goliath inequality of arms, she was then faced with a £30,000 cost bill from the bank. Now, at a different level, but John, who is somebody that I've been helping, has been in a dispute for £12,500. He actually ended up losing the claim on a technicality with the Financial Ombudsman Service and decided to reduce his claim down to £9,500 and make a claim in the small claims track of the county court. Now, I'm going to actually name the bank in this case because the geography is really, really important. TSB head office is in Scotland, but TSB's overall customer service and communication centre is in Leeds. So every letter that John had come out of the Leeds office. So when he issued a claim through the small claims track of the county court through Money Claim Online, he issued the claim addressed to the Leeds office. Now, according to the bank, they never received the notice of claim at their Leeds office, and it was not properly addressed because it should have been sent to their office in Scotland, which of course actually is a separate jurisdiction as well. They also claim that they got no notification of the hearing, because they didn't respond to the claim, the court contacted them and said, are you going to come to us? However, they did get the notice of judgment in default. When they got the notice of judgment in default, they decided that they would argue against it because they said it wasn't properly served. They proceeded now to serve on a 73-year-old pensioner in a claim of £9,500, 34 pages of legal documentation, which amongst other things says that they intend to ask the court to make a costs award against the claimant against the original small claims court order. Now, you know, this has to be almost complete nonsense. I mean, this is so David and Goliath that it is something which really concerns me. So the point I'm making here is, yes, we need the right of action, but we also need to underpin this with the ability to actually be able to exercise that right in the civil courts, because these are clearly two cases of major importance. But now I come on to a question which has actually only arisen, as far as I'm concerned, in the last 2 or 3 months. And it goes to a case where a guy I'm going to refer to as Jeff is the fraudster. He has persuaded something in the order of 155 people to invest approximately £26 million into his scheme. It is now clear that he is not paying out on that scheme. The FCA have issued a statement, so I'll read this to you. We are investigating potential breaches of the Financial Services and Markets Act, where Jeff, specifically that he may have carried on regulated activities without FCA authorization. This is a criminal offence. We are also investigating potential offences under the Fraud Act. So we now have a situation where the banks are saying, we are not going to issue final decision letters on people's complaints until the FCA complete their criminal investigation into the actions of Jeff. Now, of course, the FCA, if they intend to prosecute, are going to have to demonstrate that he has acted fraudulently to the criminal standard of beyond reasonable doubt. And they're going to take 12 to 18 months to do that. And by the time we go through the whole process, it's going to be ages before any of these people are able to make a claim against the banks, because they're claiming under the contingent reimbursement model, but the banks are now arguing it wasn't fraud. So if it's not fraud, the contingent reimbursement model doesn't apply. So we now come down to this really important question of what is fraud? And not just what is fraud, but what is the test that has to be applied. So we're now asking the question, if we take these cases to the Financial Ombudsman Service, and the Financial Ombudsman Service generically operates on the balance of probability, can we make a complaint that actually this is fraud on the balance of probability, and get the Financial Ombudsman Service to rule on the balance of probability and stuff the FCA's investigation, because that's going to take forever to actually come through. So we now have this challenge that the contingent reimbursement model is actually talks about, is it fraud or is it a civil action? But the definition and the way in which we decide whether it is fraud or not is not actually defined anywhere. So I'm just chucking this into the melting pot, because in terms of this whole right of action, we need to be able to make it work. And this 2.7.7 says I can make a complaint against the receiving bank, except I can't make a complaint against the receiving bank because I can't access any of the information about the receiving bank account, and as such I cannot prove that the receiving bank has failed to comply with the appropriate regulations. So we have this mess that's been emerging across my desk over the last couple of months. And I really see that this it's a bit of the roll-on that says, well, we get a private right of action, but actually how do we then make that private action work? We need to have a framework, almost like something like the small claims court, where people can go forward, but with much higher value claims without a terrible risk of cost. So it's just bringing something from the consumer's point of view. I believe absolutely there should be a private right of action, but we need to make sure that when we get that private right of action, it is actually an enforceable action.
Richard, thank you so much. Your last point in particular is remarkably important. Let's make sure that we include that in our consultation response, not just there being the need for a private right of action, but also one that is actually enforceable. Thank you very much indeed, Richard. Let's go to comments and questions from anyone else. Please wave a hand if you'd like to share something. We're going to open up for general Q&A and discussion now if you have something that you would like to say. Wave a hand at me if you do. Peter, thank you. Take yourself off mute, please, Peter. Thank you.
It's not easy to do sometimes. I just want to thank Richard for that. But I'd like to know, Richard, in your capacity as an advisor and consultant on bank fraud, what capacity do you act? Are you a financial advisor or a solicitor, or
no? I simply provide advice to people on how they can pursue their complaints against the banks and the Financial Ombudsman Service.
That's what I want to know. Thank you very much.
And I operate on a pro bono basis because of the FCA regulation that said that if I charge fees, I would have to be registered as a claims management company.
Oh, really? Okay, no problems. I thought you might have been a lawyer or something.
No, but I have 25 years experience as an expert witness in civil and criminal litigation, so I'm very familiar with the legal processes. So I come with that mindset, but no, I'm not a solicitor.
Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Richard. Anybody else? In which case, we'll probably start bringing things to a close. I'll go back to Mark, then Peter, then Richard for any sort of final comments, and then we'll bring the session to a close. Perhaps the most important thing for me to say is to ask everybody to step forward if you want to contribute to our consultation response. The deadline is the 15th of October. Forgive me, the deadline is the 15th of February. It's already been very, very well advanced. We're almost there. But if you wish to contribute to our response, then please step forward. I'll make a note in the chat so you'll get that reminder when you get the notes from today's session. So now we'll go to Mark, then to Peter, then to Richard for the final comments, and then we'll bring the session to a close. Mr. Mark Bishop, thank you.
Okay, so really two things. The first is I found both Peter's and Richard's comments fascinating and would stress that in effect they're looking at two aspects of the same thing. One is it's all very well to have a duty of care or consumer duty, but what then does it mean in terms of both criminal, in Peter's case, and civil, in Richard's case, consequences for those who do wrong? And I think we should address that in our final version of the document. I think if both of those individuals would be willing to contribute to the final version, that would help because they could express it better than others might do on their behalf. And the second thing I would like to say is everybody who is on this call, I know I said it before, everybody who's on this call, please do a response to this latest consultation. There is a link in my slides which will be circulated. You have until the 15th. It really is a numbers game. The more consumers respond, or people on the side of consumers, the more likely we are to get what we want. And remember, if there's only two things you say in it, we want there to be a private right of action, and we're willing to wait a reasonable period of time for it, but there has to be a firm upfront commitment to introduce it on a fixed date, or else it's valueless in terms of changing the behaviour of the industry.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Mr. Peter O'Donnell, final word from yourself, please.
The fact that there is no coordination or legislation, or that both the Financial Conduct Authority and insolvency practitioners report to different regulators means that as individuals aren't held accountable under the FCA regulations, the senior managers regime is, I don't think any action has been taken by anyone at any stage, that anyone will maintain their authorization if they put their company into liquidation and then go and start or work for another one. There must be coordination between the two, and we really have to make this sort of crime, which it is a police investigated activity.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Strong words from Mr. Peter O'Donnell. And to Richard Emery. Richard, final word from you, please.
Nothing to add. I think Mark's done a great job. Contribution. We're looking at it from slightly different points of view, but it all comes together. And we really do need to challenge the FCA to do what Parliament told them to do, rather than to do what they think they really want to do.
Absolutely, absolutely, very, very well said. on that note, we'll bring the session to a close on time, which makes a nice change. So thank you very much indeed for your attendance and participation today. Particular thanks, of course, to Mark and Peter and Richard for preparing and presenting their work today. Thank you all very much. Well done. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Have a good rest of your day, folks. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.